Okay, so today I'm going to be doing something a little bit differently. I'm going to be mastering a song and showing my process. And I want to do that for a couple of reasons. And the first reason is I want to show people that don't know anything about mastering, a thing or two. And hopefully, if you have never mastered anything before, you might pick up a few things. But on the flip side, I'm not professionally trained. I've just kind of learned things as I've been learning for the past couple of years. Um, and so if I'm doing something and you happen to know what you're doing and you see something I'm doing that could be improved or, a way that basically just ways that I can improve in my process, feel free to comment down below and let me know. Because I am open to learning things. So is throw on my free master chain. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing a series of compression of multi-band compressions in very tiny amounts, but I'm going to do it a bunch of different times. And I'm also going to be doing some different stereo, I don't know what the word is, stereoization. I don't think that's a word. I'm going to be putting things in different places in the stereo field, stereo imaging. So putting things in the mono space versus on the sides. In that sort of thing. Is I'm going to go to the loudest part of the track. So it looks like right in here, I'm going to be the loudest. What I want to do is a couple of things. I want to reduce the dynamic range, meaning the difference between these really quiet areas and these really loud areas. I want to reduce that a little bit so that I can push the total volume of the entire track up and make it louder. That's essentially what I want to do when I'm mastering that. And, I might also want to level out some EQ and add and subtract things and, whatever. But so let's look at the EQ first and foremost. And I'm turning everything else in the chain off as I do this. So, and also I'm going to go ahead on the master and throw on a soft clipper just in case. And we'll come to the master over here later, but this is just to make sure nothing goes over 0. All right, so let's look at the EQ. I might be able to boost a little bit right here, just because it seems like this area could be a little bit louder in comparison to down here. Maybe a little bit up top because I'm missing some frequencies at the very, very top end. Oh, and I forgot to mention this. I do not have the stems for this beat. I made this beat 2 or 3 years ago, and I didn't really know exactly what I was doing at the time. Kind of like now when I'm mastering, except back then it was more so on the mixing side and just learning how to produce beats and that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't have the stems to this because I lost a whole bunch of files a while back from my old hard drive. So I can't go back and remix this. So I'm kind of stuck mastering this track as is, which is unfortunate. Nowadays, obviously, if I'm mastering, I'll be mastering it as I go with everything up, all the stems up, so I can adjust things more precisely. In this case, I can't do that. So if things aren't mixed super, super well, that's why. It's because I made this 2 or 3 years ago. So okay, so I think that's about all I want to do here. I don't want to do too much here because I am going to be compressing a whole bunch of frequencies and doing different things later. So I'm going to leave that at that. So the next thing I'm going to do is open up an instance of Maximus. And I'm going to be doing that 3 times in this chain. And this is something that I do want someone's opinion on that knows what they're doing. I'm going to be using Maximus to do compression in differing amounts for different frequency ranges, and as you watch the video, you'll see what I mean by that. So for this first instance of Maximus, let's go ahead and turn it on. I'm going to have all of the compressors turned off, and the first thing I do is I take my lows. Okay. Before we do this, let's look at the bands because that's the important part. This is the kind of strange thing that I do. I start by going with the super extreme lows and the super extreme highs. And then the next instance of Maximus that I'm going to open up, I'm going to essentially do this and pull these bands in a little bit. and then I'll kind of do a similar thing to what I'm going to do now. And then on the third instance, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pull the bands in a little bit more. And in each instance of Maximus, my goal is not to do a bunch of compression. It's to do very small amounts of compression at a time. And at the end, the idea is we'll have reduced the dynamic range in small amounts and small pieces here and there so that in the end we can make things louder. So let me know if that's a good idea or a bad idea at the end of this video. If, like I said, if you definitely know what you're doing. So let's start. This is the first instance. So I'm going to make this super extreme on the ends. So I go with like 50 and below. And then on the highs, I'm going to go with like 10K and above. So let's go with like right there. That's good enough. Okay. So I'm going to start with the lows. And you'll notice I have this set to merged. Okay. The reason for that is because you often want your lower frequencies in the mono field, because your lower frequencies tend to be your kick, your 808, your sub frequencies, whatever. And the reason those are in mono is because if you're playing that in like a club or something, if it's in mono, you're going to hear it better just throughout. So that's one of the reasons why we take the lower frequencies and we push them a little bit into the merged. Now I'm only doing it 10% because just like the compression that I'm doing, I'm going to be doing this in small amounts at a time. So I'm doing 10% merged on these low frequencies. And let's go ahead and as far as the other settings on here, I try to make sure my linear phase is turned on. And the reason for that is because sometimes you can get like phasing issues and it can make your sounds like lose, I don't know how to describe it. They lose like a quality to them, like a heft to them if you have that problem. So turning on linear phase can help reduce that or remove that altogether. In these stages, I'm not low cutting too much. It's no more than 10 hertz usually, but in this case, I'm going to go with 5. So let's look at everything. So I'm going to like look at the average of the peaks and reduce the extremes by really small amounts if necessary. So let's look at this. So if I just let this loud part play for a second and we pause it for you, but if you look to the right on the graph where the red line is, what I want to do is just barely reduce this. Here, let me do this. I want to get this line to like right about here so that I'm just barely reducing the peaks where they get louder than like where the rest of them seem to land. I don't know if what I just said makes sense, but I'm hoping that the visual on the right side where that line is going to make sense. So I'm going to show you how you can do like micro adjustments here in just a second. So I'm going to get this close to where I could, close to where I want it. So this is a little bit below where I want it, but then I'm going to bring it over here to the left. Okay, so if I just let this play as is, I'm going to be compressing anything below that red line, and as we can see, it's a little bit below where I want it. It's a little bit below like where the average peaks are, so let's play it. So yeah, it's compressing basically every time it's landing, which is what I don't want. I don't want that. So I'm going to pull this pre-knob down until I'm just barely compressing the top of this. So let me let it play. I'm just going to pull this down. Okay, I think I found the level. So at about -2 dBs on this pre-level, you'll see if I pause it and replay real quick. You'll see the only time it's compressing is right here, and there's like a little mini microscopic moment here that it's doing it, and it's just barely bringing down the stuff that's above the average of these peaks, and that's what I want. Okay, so in this stage, in this particular instance, I'm barely doing any compression at all, and it will basically not be noticeable. Something else I like to do, and this is again something else I would like advice on if I'm not doing this properly. On the low end, I like to keep the attack a little bit higher and the release and sustain a little bit lower. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a saturation type, so either A or B, and I flip back and forth between these two all the time. I just kind of go with, like I listen to both, and then I pick the one I like the sound of better. So I'm going to pull this down basically all the way, and then I'm going to pull the ceiling down until it's just barely below where these peaks are over here. And I'm going to listen to what it sounds like before and after. Oh, I forgot to do the makeup gain earlier. That might be part of the reason why it's kind of hard to hear. So, okay. This video is falling apart. Holy cow. So earlier when I was compressing the lows, I pulled this down to get more precise on the compression, but I forgot to do the makeup gain part. So I lowered the gain of this whole low range by 2 decibels. So what we want to do is make that gain up. So I pulled this down too. So we have to go to this post gain and pull that up by 2. I forgot to do that. I think I like this one, right? It's just kind of personal preference most of the time. So once I find the one I like, I take it down to 1% because I'm going to be doing this a couple of times. So I don't want to do this too much. And then I'm going to bring the ceiling down until it's just barely affecting like the top of these frequencies. So I'm just going to barely bring it down. And doing this can do a similar thing with your gain. This can reduce the overall gain by a slight amount. I don't know why I said it like that. By a slight amount. So if you notice a little bit of that, you can increase the gain by a small bit. Just to kind of make up for that. So, you know what, I'm not doing much to these lows here aside from the saturation and putting it in mono because they were pretty well managed. The peaks were. Like they weren't bouncing up and down too much. So let's go to the mids. Now the mids, if y'all will remember, look how wide the mids are here. So this is going to be like basically the entire track. So the amount of compression I'm going to do on this is going to be very tiny, if at all. Kind of like what I just did to the low end. Normally I would do more compression to the low end, but like I said, I mixed this years ago, and I think what I did was I put a soft clipper on the master, and it like chopped it all off, and it did some of this for me, but maybe not quite the way I wanted it. Doesn't matter. Anyway, so because this is basically the entire frequency range of the beat, I don't want to do too much to just let it play, because now I'm going to see if anything is going above this line, which it shouldn't be, because like I said, I think I had a soft clipper on the master. What I am going to do, however, is pause it there. And I'm going to bring this line down until... So I'm looking at the peaks, and I'm trying to find like what looks to be the average of my peaks. So most of my peaks are hitting... So I'm going to bring this line down. So that actually seems to be pretty close to where like the average of my peaks are. You'll see if you look to the right, some of them are a little bit above, some are a little bit below, and some are like right on it. I might push a little bit of volume into this so that, you know, there's a little bit more above this line, so I'm chopping more off with the compressor. But this is pretty close. So I'm going to bring this over to the left so that it's on this straight line. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. You want this on the straight line so that you're getting compression. Like normal compression. Alright, so on the mids here, on the lows, I had a high attack, low release, low sustain. I'm going to kind of do the opposite of that, or not the opposite, but like middle ground. So I'm going to have a slightly faster attack, a slightly longer release, and a slightly longer sustain. So it's kind of in the middle. And let's just look and see what we're doing here. So I'm compressing just a little bit off the top end, and like I said, I think I'm going to push a little bit more into that. So I'm going to go up 0.3. I don't think I want to be compressing this much though, so let me back it back off. I just barely want to be taking stuff off of this because this is the majority. Look how much orange there is. This is the majority of the beat. I just barely want to be doing compression at this stage. So I'm really only compressing down the super, super loud stuff. Like that. That right there. And that right there. And that right there. So you'll notice I really only want this to take down the stuff that's super, super loud. Everything else I don't want to affect, because at this stage I just want to do very small micro adjustments. And I don't mess with the stereo separation at this stage. I also don't add any saturation. Let's go to the highs. So this is what the highs are. They're in about 10K and above, around there, a little bit above. So let's solo this. Oh, and I'm also, at this stage, I'm taking the highs and I'm putting them in like the separated, that was a horrible way of saying it. I'm separating them in the stereo field is a better way of saying that. So here you can see I've just barely took off a little bit there. Let me pause and replay it. I want to push this into it a little bit. So let me go up 0.4 and just see if we take a little bit off. Just small amounts of compression. We just want to make sure things are level, like on a micro scale at this point. So I start to get a little bit of compression. Okay, so I got a little bit there. Small amount. That's all I really want. A little bit more there. This might be the sweet spot because I'm just catching little moments where high frequencies are jumping up. And that's really all I want to do. I just want to catch the stuff that's just barely jumping up out at, in the mix. Okay. And so, all right, now this time we did the opposite. We brought the gain up. I just made a fart noise with my mouth. This video is all over the place. I apologize. Okay, so this time we did the opposite. We brought the pre-gain up by 2.2 dBs. So now we need to bring it down by 2.2. So I'm going to take this knob and bring it down by 2.2. Very high stuff. Okay, so let's go to the master. So again, at this stage, we want to do things in very small amounts. So on the low, I did higher attack, faster release. Mids, I kind of evened them out a little bit. And then on the high end, I forgot to do this, I'm doing the opposite. I want a faster attack and a slower release. Right, and then I'm going to leave these default for the master. Okay. So let's bring the master down. And then let's let it play for a second. Then let's look at the very top end and see where like the peaks are just bouncing out, just ever so slightly. Okay, so let's look right here. So if we look at this, that looks to be pretty close to where I want it. Because I'd just barely be chopping off the top there. If I brought it down here, that'd be too far. I could do a compromise. I can go here and then push into it just ever so slightly. I might do that. I'm going to leave it here and then push into it about 2 or 0.2 dB. So let's push into it 0.2. So we're just barely compressing it. We might be doing it a little bit too often, so I'm going to bounce this back. I wanted it at 0.1. Okay, so same thing. I increased this by 0.1, so I'm going to bring this down by 0.1. Yeah, I think I'm going to bring it down to 0 again, actually. So the level I had it at was fine. So I'm just barely cutting this off. I'm barely compressing just the stuff that jumps out at the very top. Okay, so let's do a little overview. So this is just the first of 3 instances of Maximus. So in this one, I'm focusing on like the extreme lows and highs. And in the lows, and on all of these, I'm barely compressing hardly at all. I just want to tame those extremes that pop out and poke out. On the lows, I'm merging things, making them a little bit more mono and putting a little bit of saturation on it. And then small amounts of compression. The mids, I'm doing as little compression as possible because, and I'm not changing the stereo separation at all. I'm also not doing anything with the saturation. With the highs, I'm separating it, so I'm pushing it out into the stereo field a little bit. I'm not doing any saturation at all, and again, I'm just doing very small amounts of compression. And on the master, I'm kind of treating the master like I treated the mids. I'm doing as little compression as possible. Negative 1.5. So we essentially reduced the dynamic range of the entire track by about 1 decibel, which is kind of strange because we did barely any compression at all in each range, like in each frequency range. We just did very tiny amounts. All we did was tame the very extremes in each case, and yet, even with barely doing any compression at all, we still managed to squeeze everything down by a decibel. So I'm going to continue to do this. I'm going to do this 2 other times, and I'm going to do it just in small amounts and with different ranges of frequencies. And the idea is, if I do this a couple of times, I'm going to squeeze as much volume out of this track as I possibly can. At least that's the idea. Master chain. So, which is an instance of patcher, which is this. This is cool. It's like a stereo separation thing, which I'm already doing with Maximus, but this lets me do it a little bit more and with more bands. So if you open up an instance of patcher and then go 3-band stereo separation. So if you click on that, it just opens this up. And what I've done is I've made everything mono, and then I push the lows to, so if you turn these this way, it makes it mono, and if you turn it that way, it makes it separated. So I take the lows, and I pull them to the mono a little bit, take the highs, push them out a little bit, and sometimes I'll do the opposite with these, and I'll pull them in. So the mid-highs are going separated, and the low mids are going mono. And you can play with these to get settings that you like, but be careful with how much you do here. I like to do this in very small amounts, so just do little changes. So we have patcher again. This is an instance of mid-side EQ. So what I've done is, if you open up patcher and you go to where it says mid-side right here, you'll open up a mid-side EQ, and I'm going to undo this because I don't want this. So I've done that here, and then in the middle of this chain, for just the signals going to the mids, I have an instance of Fruity Limiter. And the reason why I do this is, well, I do this for a couple of reasons. One, it lets me change the EQ differently in the stereo separation, so in the sides and in the middle. And another thing I like to do is, just on the stuff going to the mids, I like to add a small amount of saturation just on the loudest parts, which basically just means the bass or the kick. So come here and bring the saturation down into this, and let me make this big so we can see it. I'm going to bring the saturation so that the loudest stuff is just barely going into it. So just barely going into it. That's going to give us a little bit of like heft, a little bit of texture on the low end stuff. Okay, so I also at this stage listen for frequencies in the mids and the sides and decide what I like to add and take away. So let's listen to the sides. Okay, now I'm going to open up a second instance of Maximus, and I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to compress different frequency ranges in small amounts, in almost just as small amounts hopefully as before. And as I do this more and more, the idea is I'm going to be doing less and less, and at the end I'll have made a big difference by doing a little bit at a time. So let's open up this instance of Maximus. So in the first instance of Maximus, I went as low as 50 Hertz and as high as about 10K. So this time I'm going to bring it in from that. So instead of 50, I'm going to bring it into, let's go with like 150. 152 is fine. And then instead of 10K, let's go to like 5K, 4.5K. Is every instance of Maximus you open up, if you don't pull this knob down, you're going to get some delay. And so as it is now, I've got quite a bit of delay going on because I have two different instances of Maximus, and they both have a little bit of delay. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so I've got my ranges about where I want them. Let me listen to it. Okay, so let's do the same thing we did before. So I'm going to go to my lows. I'm going to turn on the compressor, solo the lows. Okay, so the average of the peaks is what I'm looking at. That seems to be pretty close to perfectly where I want it. So I might just leave it there, bring it over here, so that we're on this line. And again, on the lows, I'm going to bring my attack a little bit higher. Bring the release down. So we're just barely compressing the loudest parts. And we're also taking this signal as well, and we're merging it another 10%. So we did, I think it was 10% last time. We're doing another 10% this time. All right, let's go to our mids. Compress around to about where the average of the peaks seems to be. So that's a little bit too low, that's a little bit too high. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to push it into this. So I'm going to push this up a couple of maybe 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, maybe a little bit more. We'll see. Let's start with like 0.4. Just barely grabbing it. Okay, so on the lows we had higher attack, low release. So I'm going to do kind of in the middle. I'm going to go kind of in the middle for both. Let's go with that. Just barely grabbed it there and there. Let's push it a little bit more into this. So we got to do the opposite. So on the pre we raised it up by 0.7. So on the post we have to lower it by 0.7. Okay, I forgot. I'm going to add some saturation on this stage as well and just see if it makes it sound better. If it doesn't, I'm going to not add any more saturation. And that's kind of how I do saturation. I add it in small amounts at a time until it stops sounding good to me, and then I stop adding it altogether. So let's see if this makes it sound better. This is like thumpier and cleaner sounding to me, so I think I'd like this one. I like A better. So I'm going to go up to just barely adding any at all. Let's go to 1%. And then I just want this to barely affect it. So let me back this down. And I'm bringing this down so that it's like just barely affecting everything. So anything below this shaded region is, I'm sorry, anything above this is like what's being affected at all. Go to the highs. All right, so on the highs, we are separating it another 10%. Let's bring this down. Okay, so I compressed that part quite a bit, but I'm not compressing anything else. Okay, so I think that's where I want it. So this is going up by 1.4, so this needs to come down by 1.4. Okay, so if we pause this, that's where it gets the loudest. But it seems like there are some little moments below that. So I think I'll start here and then push it into it just barely. Oh, and on the highs, I forgot to change this to lower attack, higher release, higher sustain. And this one, we're going to leave these kind of the way that they are. Okay, so I want to push this into the compressor just barely. So let's maybe go 0.3. I'm just pushing it until I start to barely see some compression. So I'm seeing a little bit here. Let me back off a little bit. I just barely want to catch those loud parts. Alright, so let's look at our EQ balance again. Make sure everything is the way that we want it. So here's our next instance of Maximus. So this is the third and final one for my pre-master chain. So in this Maximus one, I did just the extremes. In the second one, I brought it in a little bit. And you can probably guess what I'm going to do on this one. I'm going to bring it in even more. Except this time I'm going to do it with like a purpose. So before it was mostly just like getting extremes. This time I'm going to do it like while listening for specific things. So let's open up Maximus. Make sure it's on linear. So in this instance, I'm going to give it another, we'll say 10% for the lows and another 10% for the highs. But let's go to the bands and actually pick our lows and our highs. So before we did, like I said, it was a little bit more haphazard. It was just kind of like really, really low. We pulled it in a little bit. This time, let's be a little bit more mindful with what we do. So I'm going to pull this band back until I can no longer hear the kick. So I can technically still hear the kick up here, but I also know that this is not the meat of that kick or that 808 sound. So I probably don't want to go too much higher than here. I'm going to probably stop around here. 500 maybe. Sorry, I had to think about what I was doing. And I'm going to pull the other band back until I can no longer hear the hi-hat. And I'm going to pull this band up a little bit more so that I'm hearing the kick a little bit less. Let's listen. You'll notice I've got this merged another 10%. So we're just barely taking off the high parts, the average of the high parts. This is a little bit too much compression, a little bit more than I want, because it's compressing like almost every single hit. So let me back it off a little bit. So now it's not every single time, it's just the highest parts. So I backed this off 0.9 dBs, so let's go the opposite way here. Let's go up 0.9 to make up that gain difference. And we're on the lows, so let's make sure the attack is a little bit higher. Slow release, or I'm sorry, fast release. Right, let's go to our mids. Okay, you might be able to push this just a little bit more. So let's go up like 0.1, 0.2. Yeah, so if I push that up 0.2, I need to push this down 0.2. Okay, let's go to our highs. This is being separated by another 10%. Okay, just barely compressing the loudest portions of it. Okay, let's go back to the lows. I forgot, I'm going to add a little bit more distortion in this case and see if it sounds better. If it doesn't sound better, I'm going to take it off. So let's just check and see. So I'm going to go extreme just so I can really hear the difference. Okay, I'm really just going back and forth between the two until I find like the one that I like the sound of better. And I'm playing with the ceiling until I get up to a point where I'm not losing punch, but I'm also adding a little bit of like texture to the sound. So I found a point in the ceiling where I liked that. And I think I like the B type better. So I'm going to go to 1%. So I'm just barely adding any at all. So let's just barely take a little tiny bit off. So we're just barely doing compression here. So on the highs, we want our attack to be faster. Mids, we want it in between. And lows, we want a slower attack. And for this, we want this to be kind of in the middle. So we're just barely doing any compression here. Just barely taming the stuff that gets really loud. So if I bring this down by 0.1, I bring this up by 0.1. So I'm just barely getting it, just barely compressing it. So let's look at the fruity limiter. So I can boost the gain of this by quite a bit. So let's see how much we can boost this before we start to limit it. Three decibels. And I'm doing a little bit of limiting, so let me back off. Didn't save it. And so I'm basically done with the pre-master chain. So let's turn the chain off and on and compare it before and after. So I basically just did a chain of small amounts of compression in different areas of the EQ field, and the combination of which, doing small amounts of compression over time, allows me to just kind of shave off the peaks here and there and here and there and here and there. And if you do that enough, the idea is you can get a pretty big difference in the amount of volume that you can push. Here to the master chain. And up until now, I only had a soft clipper on it, and the reason for that was just to make sure I wasn't going above zero. Now that I've done, I'm going to throw on a master preset, which also has a soft clipper on it. And this is just to make sure at the end of everything that I'm not going above zero. Okay, so we're going to start the same way we started with the pre-master chain. And I'm going to turn basically everything off. Let's look at the first EQ. And normally, I almost always take off in this stage a little bit of the low end, just cut it off just a little bit. And the way that I found how much to cut off was I essentially put this filter on, and then I backed it off looking at a gain meter until I saw the most, like the biggest amount of gain increase. Different things. I'm going to open up an instance of Fruity Limiter with a little bit of saturation on it, and that's just going to add saturation to the loudest parts that are going into the limiter here. But before that, I'm going to open up an instance of Fruity Compressor. So let's turn off the compressor for now and just look and see what everything looks like. Okay, so one of the reasons I have this open here is A, to make sure I'm not going above zero, but also because when I open up my compressor here, you'll notice that once I turn this on, everything's going to get a little bit louder. Okay, and I'm also doing a little bit of limiting here, so let me back off the gain. compressor, I essentially just played with these settings until I got the effect that I wanted. So somewhere between 2 and 3 to 1 on the ratio is typically what gives me good effects when I'm throwing it on the entire master chain. And then compare it to slower. The sounds don't sound quite as meaty, and I think the reason for that is because the compressor is chomping down on the sound a little bit slower, a little bit later, and so you're keeping a little bit more of that heft going into the sound. But play with these settings until you get something that sounds right. You can also play with the knee as well and get the right sound that you want. And you'll notice I'm adding very small amounts of saturation at a bunch of different stages. And the reason for that is because at each point I'm doing that, I don't know, getting a little bit of saturation at a time can just kind of give you a little bit more like punch to your drums, to your drum sounds. I don't know how to describe it, but just play with how much saturation you add. Adding too much can ruin the sound. So if you do something like this, it's like muffled compared to that. So play with how much saturation you're adding, but I found that if you add very small amounts in increments, over time, you can get pretty cool effects, pretty good effects. Okay, so I know that we already opened up 3 different instances of Maximus, but I'm going to do the same thing a 4th time, and I think this is the final time. So let's open up Maximus and make sure it's on linear. I've already done plenty of low cutting, so we don't need to low cut anymore. And in this case, I'm going to do the same thing I did on the 3rd instance of Maximus. I'm going to intentionally pull these bands to where my kick and my hi-hat are. So let's go with the low. Except I'm going to be a little bit more like... I want to be a little bit more even with the bands this time. And hopefully you'll see what I mean by that here in a second. So let's... So the meat of the kick is like being lost somewhere in here. Both right there. Alright, now let's pull this back so we don't hear the hats. Okay. Alright, so lows, we're going to merge it another 10%. Mids, we're not going to touch. Highs, we're going to separate another 10%. So we're doing that in small amounts as well, so that we're just barely affecting the sound at all. So this is getting compressed basically every time the kick hits, or the 808 hits. So let's bring it down. That seems to be sweet spot. We're really only getting the super loud stuff. Oh, I need to make sure my attack is higher on the lows. Forgot to do that. I think that's where I want that. So I raised this up by 0.4, so let's lower this by 0.4. Go to the highs. Make the attack really fast. Okay, I might want to back this one off a little bit, because in this section I'm affecting it kind of often. Back it off 0.2. Too much here, which is good. Let's go to the master. So you can see my peaks are pretty even now, which is kind of what I'm looking for. That's too much, I think, so let me back off by 0.4, 0.5. So that's happening like all the time, which I don't want. Let me pull it back a little bit. Alright, let's try adding saturation to the lows, although at this stage I've already done added so much saturation that I probably don't want to add any more, but let's just try it and see what it sounds like. Okay, so I have an instance of a multiband compressor. I don't normally use it. It's just kind of there in case I need it, because I'm already doing multiband compression throughout, so I don't necessarily need this. Let's go to the EQ and let's just look and see how everything looks. We're not hitting 0 dBs, so we can actually push this volume a little bit and make it a little bit louder. Let's open up another instance of this. This one is kind of optional because we've already been doing this a lot throughout, so this is just to make sure the stereo is where you want it. So until the volume is getting stopped by the limiter, and then I'm going to see how much volume that is, and that's how much I'm going to add and push into the soft clip. So -0.6. You can see at -0.6, I'm barely going into the limiter, just a little bit at times. So -0.6 is my number, I think. Soft clipper. And then I'm going to come to this EQ here, and I'm just going to boost everything up by 0.6. So let's compare before and after everything. So let's turn everything off. That's before and after. So I don't know if I did the best job of explaining myself earlier, but essentially what we did was in stages, we compressed different frequency ranges in very small amounts. Like I said, in stages. So just a little bit here, a little bit there, just kind of shaving off anywhere that we can without losing any grit or any sound, any body, without losing any of the characteristic of the sound. And doing that in small amounts, just over and over and over again, just to push everything up to be as loud as it possibly can be. And then some of the other things that we did were stereo imaging, like putting the lower frequency range things in the mono field and putting the higher frequency range ones in the separated stereo field. Which, if I had the stems, I would have done so. Here it is one last time.